It is such a pleasure to welcome back to the U.S.-China Institute one member of our Board of Scholars, the terrific China watcher, David M. Lampton. Professor Lampton is one of the most distinguished, one of the most influential China scholars anywhere. And together with Selina Ho and Cheng-Chwee Kuik, has produced a wonderful new book called Rivers of Iron, Railroads and Chinese Power, which is available now. It's just out from the University of California Press. The book is outstanding. It was my pleasure to get a chance to read it in its Kindle edition, which came out a little bit ahead of the hard copy. Professor Lampton is Professor Emeritus from the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. He's the longtime head of the school's China programs, and he served as dean from 2004 to 2012. He has served as the president of the National Committee for U.S.-China Relations, and he was a founding member of our Board of Scholars. He has taught elsewhere, but he's most closely associated with Johns Hopkins. He is the author of numerous books. He has written or edited 12 books, and prior to this one, he produced Following the Leader, Ruling China from Deng to Xi, and my favorite of his books, Three Faces of Chinese Power, Might, Money, and Minds. But these are just a couple of the topics he's looked at over the course of his career. He's looked at decision-making, policy implementation. He's looked at the role of bureaucracy. He's looked at elite mobility. He's also looked at things having to do with the politics of healthcare, something, of course, that is of interest to all of us. Professor Lampton is a Californian, and he's quite proud of having worked as a fireman to pay his way through Stanford. And my guess is that there are not many people who can make that claim, and probably almost no China watchers who fall into that category. So, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are, please join me in welcoming Professor David M. Lampton to our webinar. Professor Lampton, great to see you.
Thank you, Clay. And I was born in Glendale, not too far from you. So life comes full circle. And I want to thank you for arranging this, and for our audience that I hope will find of interest what our conversation produces.
I'm pretty confident they will. The Belt and Road Initiative is, of course, a grand undertaking and touches on, virtually, at least half of the world in various parts. We know about the many countries that have Belt and Road projects associated with them. But as you know, what is Belt and Road is sometimes a little bit vague. And one of the striking things in your book is how you're taking on this thing in motion. Now, you've chosen to focus on one aspect of it, but it's a gigantic aspect. We're talking about building high-speed rail throughout Southeast Asia, bringing that area fully integrating it with China. And it's a remarkable undertaking. Now, on page 48 of the book, you warn us. You say a full assessment of this undertaking is going to take a while, decades. But yet you plunge in, you and your colleagues plunge in to what is a multinational investigation. You're looking not just at China, but of course at the countries in Southeast Asia to be connected through this rail network. Why did you choose to do this?
Well, life is funny. Ideas come to you, but they build on, sort of accumulate your past interests. And I've always been interested in infrastructure per se. And I did quite a few studies on water conservancy and lived in China in 1982 to study the planning and management of the Yangtze River Valley that drains about 1/3 of the provinces of China. And it was fascinating. And I chose the infrastructure is a great topic to study because it crosses boundaries. And in politics, politics is interesting precisely because different groups with different interests, different values have to interact. And so when a project or a river crosses these boundaries and you propose to deal with the problems that arise from that, you've got politics. And I've often thought Westerners were a little preoccupied with what Xi Jinping's doing today, yesterday, and tomorrow. Not that it's not important, but for most people, most of the time, what's going on in their locality is of more salience, and it's certainly political, and it forces lower levels to deal with higher levels, different ministries to deal with each other. So I've always had that interest. Now, in this era of globalization, I thought it'd be interesting to look at a transnational infrastructure project with the same underlying intellectual questions. How do you see politics unfold across boundaries? In this case, altogether, there are 8 countries, 7 in Southeast Asia that we look intensively at. And plus China. And then as we got into it, it became clear we were going to have to look at Indonesia, even though it's not directly part of this set of projects. So 9 enormous countries, in excess of 400 million people. And I do want to emphasize something while I'm talking here. I had 3 equal co-authors. And the fact that there are 3 co-authors wasn't accidental. Precisely because there were 9 countries, vastly different histories, vastly different governmental systems, some highly democratic in their character. I'd say Malaysia in many respects. Certainly Singapore is an interesting case, but you'd have to say democratic in many respects. And then you have countries like Cambodia and Myanmar, not to mention China itself. So basically, this was a research task that no single scholar could undertake. Between the language considerations, Rolodex, who are you going to interview across 9 countries? I spent my whole life really looking at China. So connections, access, understanding on the ground. And when you do infrastructure projects, you got to get on the ground. You can't just sit in a newspaper stack or a data set and look at it. You got to get down on the ground and understand what are the problems in developing a plan, getting acceptance for the plan, implementing it, and lots of unanticipated things develop. So it's that bundle of intellectual questions that interests me. How do local governments and people affect policy? Another whole set of questions, of course, is China is sort of painted as this unstoppable force. And of course, in many respects, it is. But what I think one of the main findings here is Southeast Asian countries have a lot of leverage, even over China. And sometimes you might even feel for China in the degree to which it can be manipulated by much smaller and, in many respects, weaker countries.
Well, that's one of the things that very much comes through is that there are many players in this, not just at the national level, but at local levels and other subnational players, companies, other firms, other parts of different bureaucracies. And so that very much comes through in this study. Let me take a moment here to share a map that's in the book so that people can get a sense of what we're looking at.
I started out by saying, ideas come to you at a strange time. I had that intellectual apparatus that I just mentioned, but I was reading the Straits Times out of Singapore. And lo and behold, this map has been corrected from the original and is updated. But basically, this map appeared in a paper, and I was reading it early one morning over my coffee, and I said, this is a huge engineering task. The network you see in front of you is equivalent to 3 transcontinental railroads in the United States. And at least our American participants will recognize how profoundly that changed the West, and indeed Stanford University and Leland Stanford and so forth. So, but the basic idea that's revealed here is a network of 3 basically north-south lines connecting southern China, Kunming, down to Singapore at the tip of the Malay Peninsula. And there are 3, as I said, potential routes, and they all meet at Bangkok. And they start at Kunming in southern China. Now, Kunming is the southern hub for China's high-speed rail system that already has approximately 29,000 kilometers. So what's being portrayed here will actually hook Southeast Asia into China's very extensive system. And then, of course, to the degree to which it builds out the other corridors of BRI, altogether there are 6 corridors. So Southeast Asia is not only thinking about the implications of hooking into China, but gaining access to that whole network that they see, however fast or slow, participating in Central Asia, Northeast Asia, and so forth. So I'll just say the first line going from the east, South China Sea, it starts in Kunming, then goes to Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh City, Phnom Penh, Bangkok. Go back to Kunming up in the north, and then look at the central line that goes north-south, and it goes to Vientiane, the capital of Laos, then down to Bangkok. And then if you start again at Kunming and go to the west, it goes through Myanmar, Burma, Mandalay, down to Yangon, Rangoon, and to Bangkok. And so a very important part of this story is Bangkok and Thailand, because it sees itself as essentially, if you think in continental terms in the America, playing a role like Chicago played in the development of the United States as a big transshipment point for goods, a sort of north-south, east-west connectivity center, and so forth. Now, all 3 lines merge at Bangkok if they all get built, and will go down through Singapore, and there may be an east coast. There will be an east coast line, and there may be another one that goes on to the East Bay of Bengal. But basically, you're talking about 3 north-south lines that knit together 7 Southeast Asian countries, and the hub in the north would be Kunming, and the terminus is Singapore. Anyway, I was looking at that newspaper and thinking about this map, and I said, well, this is a daunting engineering task. Just take Laos, for example. About 70% of that rail line, central line going from the Chinese border down to the Mekong River, is 70% of its bridges and tunnels. Those are huge engineering feats in and of themselves. And of course, you're talking about high-speed rail. That's over various definitions of high-speed rail, but you're going, let's just say, 160 to 250 kilometers an hour. So tolerances have to be, that you can't have sloppy construction on this. Let's put it that way. So in any case, that line it presents a lot of problems. Also, during the Vietnam War, the United States dropped unfathomable amounts of ordnance there. And in fact, the Chinese one engineering group we talked to actually out in the field of Laos said, I wish you'd Americans would clean up the mess you left here. They're facing slowdowns just because of all the ordnance and so forth. So every one of these lines has its challenges. And if you take all these countries as a whole, you've got a lot of different socioeconomic levels. Singapore at a very high level economically. You've got Cambodia as on the poorer end, and Laos at the real poor end of the spectrum. But Malaysia and Thailand have resources. So one of the issues is what influence do these countries have over as they have to negotiate with China to what leverage do they have? What leverage does the Chinese have? And just to give you this one example, because we've got the map up, that central line through Laos, Laos is the poorest country and really has the fewest people, and in that sense, you could say derives the least benefit. But on the other hand, it's an absolutely central link because you don't go anywhere if you don't start going through Laos. So Laos, as poor as it is, does have some leverage, but the Chinese have enormous leverage over Laos because if the Laos don't take on the debt and play ball with the Chinese can say, we're going through Hanoi and Vietnam to the east, or we'll go to the west through Burma. And the last thing the Laos want is to be poor and isolated with all the economic and human flows going on. So it's a very interesting question. Who has leverage under what conditions on what issues?
Yeah, thank you for taking us through that map. And also, since it's a flat map, it's a two-dimensional map, highly simplified with the capitals and straight lines for the railroads and things like that. You've complicated that by talking about just how mountainous Laos is and the need to engineer tunnels through this. It's a massive undertaking. Now, one of the things that you mentioned in your opening comments was about your work on the Yangtze River Valley and how various development projects proceeded. And one of the things that you mentioned in the book is back in 1982, somebody showed you a map from 1959, the Great Leap Forward era. And you mention in the book that you were struck at how many of those ambitions had been realized to some extent or another. And so the map that we just showed is, this fully fleshed out, developed map. And some people might say, well, how likely is that?
Right.
But in your experience, a lot can be built.
Right. Well, this maybe is a general point, and it needs a lot of discussion, but I'll sort of throw it out in start form. I think that, we Americans often have a bias against planning, often not realizing how much planning goes into our own society. So we have a sort of natural distrust, and then we talk about industrial policy and subsidies, and we sort of conclude that sooner or later, these aren't high probabilities for success here. And I'm not saying I don't know what percentage of this we'll ever visualize, but I have the feeling that map at some point, 2, 3, maybe 4 decades down the track, we're going to look back and say they achieved a whole lot, a big percentage of this. Now, the interesting thing, I did mention that map in the book, and one of the conclusions I said is while it's remarkable how many of those projects got built, there were many that weren't, but there were many that were never anticipated but were built. But overall, the impression is of a huge correspondence between those plans during the Great Leap Forward and carried on into the 2000s. And I have the feeling we're looking at that, and it gets to a larger point. The U.S., and I'm not blaming the U.S., I'm not blaming anybody, I'm trying to observe, but I think we're in a national mood of committing two opposite errors. One is exaggerating Chinese capacities and Chinese power over these countries. But on the other hand, we're in danger of underestimating the degree to which, just because some or a lot of projects have corruption or environmental opposition or displace people by land acquisition, all infrastructure projects have these problems. And if you just think about it, the United States, in the course of building its rail infrastructure alone, 9% of the surface area of the continental United States was given to railroads. You want to talk about subsidies. the biggest corruption we've ever had was the credit mobilier crisis. Involved, I guess, the Speaker of the House, and it was extensive. So we're in a national frame of mind of looking at all the things China and others, the mistakes we think they're making. And I'm sure there are, but building infrastructure is a messy business. Just look at the big dig in Boston. I forgot the exact numbers, but I think it came in the bid. Everybody bids low for infrastructure because they want the contract. And then once they start digging, people have to pay because you got all these sunk costs. Well, I think the big dig came in somewhere around $12 to $14 billion instead of 2 to 3, and took at least twice as long. And then the day, practically soon after it opened, there was a collapse in the tunnel, and they had to shut it down for another year. So that it's not to excuse everything China's doing. It's not to, but the point is, if you see how the rest, holding China in comparative perspective, how does the rest of the world work? And the answer is not always too well, as we are seeing now.
Right. And you've just given a 19th century example and then a 20th and 21st century example of big projects. Here in California, we're still working on that high-speed rail. And so this is something that Jerry Brown dreamed about in his first term as governor back in the 70s. But I wanted to back up a couple of steps here and ask you to unpack two things. One is this fixation, this focus, this trust in infrastructure. I would suggest that kind of Chinese development theory has two components. One, a belief in education, and two, a belief in infrastructure. And you talk at some length about that in the book. Comes from how it functions. So that would be the first question. And then the second question is the attractiveness of Southeast Asia for Chinese planners. Of course, Belt and Road has a Central Asian component. Africa is part of this discussion as well. Our focus here is on Southeast Asia and the fact that it's a younger population, a growing population, and a rising population in terms of its economic potential. So maybe you could say something about the trust in infrastructure and the attractiveness for Chinese planners of Southeast Asia.
Well, those are great questions, and I think very practical questions. The first is why the Chinese belief in infrastructure to the degree they do, and to what degree does that correspond with the belief systems that we see in Southeast Asian countries? And I'll overstate just to make the point, and then if you push me very hard, I'll back off to be reasonable. But the Chinese have an aphorism: to get rich, build a road. Their basic view is that infrastructure leads economic growth. So if you basically have a methodology, a thought process that will grow and we'll get rich, and as we go along, we'll build infrastructure as we need it, but you can't quite do that because it takes a number of years to do after you decide you need it, right? The Chinese approach is basically build it, and economic and activity and human migration will build around the nodes you're building, and it will drive economic progress. And of course, China developed most extensively and quickest along the coast, both historically and more recently, because they had transportation, ocean transportation and maritime transportation. But the rest of China in reform certainly did well, but not as well as the coast. So the Chinese, to open up their interior, and particularly the biggest promoters in Southeast Asian infrastructure in China, are the provinces along Southeast Asia. It may surprise people that China was actually connected by railroad to Hanoi before it was connected to its own coastline. So the proximity of the inland provinces, Sichuan, Yunnan, Guangxi, these are big areas, and certainly Sichuan potentially very rich. So colonialists early on wanted to build railroads there, and the French and the British played a big role. But basic point is there's this belief in build transportation, highways, roads, now we'd have to say cyber pathways, air, and so forth. But railroads are a very big part of this connectivity. Now, we have this frame of mind that China always is sort of badgering people to do what China wants them to do. And there's a not an insignificant reason to believe that. But in this particular case, this is China actually jumped on a Southeast Asian train. It's not Southeast Asians jumping on a Chinese train. And that is to say, after, you had the British and the French and indeed some Japanese rail development to go. But after the countries, sort of after World War II and the liberation of colonies and semi-colonies, the new governments themselves adopted the idea of connectivity. And ASEAN has always promoted this. And there's the Mekong groups and so forth. So connectivity has been one of the central concepts. And you'll note that Mahathir, the former prime minister, endorsed the book precisely because he wanted, well, he can speak for himself, but the idea this is a Chinese idea isn't exactly right. Mahathir went to the Chinese and asked Zhurongji to help sponsor it. And he says, well, we don't have the money or the technology now, but I'll assure you one thing, China's going to build railroads in China before it builds them in Southeast Asia. So what's happened is a convergence now between Chinese finance, technological capability, engineering capability, and the desires, and these countries in Southeast Asia, getting more urbanized, more middle class, higher per capita incomes. So that gets to your second question, which is, well, so what's the attraction to the Chinese? Well, the attraction is, I think, first of all, China has a vision of itself. And, we can like it or not, but I think this is their vision. And we're going through the painful process now of adjusting to that vision. And their vision is that China is the hub of economic activity around its entire periphery. Mm-hmm. Now, you may say that's not achievable. You may say it's not desirable from some point of view, but stripped to its essentials, that is the vision. And so the question is, where do you invest first? And Southeast Asia is receptive, as I just described. Now, that doesn't mean everybody likes the plan the Chinese have or the deal they're willing to cover. So not to get too carried away, but the long and the short of it is the Chinese see a rapidly growing middle class. There's also tremendous Chinese, overseas Chinese activity and communities here, and they have tight commercial links with China in any case. So you have human resources scattered throughout the region that are very entrepreneurial and want to do business with China. And let's say that does scare we'll say the non-Chinese populations to some extent, so that has to be handled. But, also China's labor costs are going up.
Right.
And that means that as it moves up the value chain, it wants to offload its, more labor-intensive, lower value-added industries southward. And they're already migrating to Vietnam, to much less to Laos, Myanmar, many textiles, and so forth. So as China moves up the value-added chain, this is the most appropriate place to offload a lot of that. And of course, you want to make the products that are made now, or the components to value added, that go back to China. You don't want them going somewhere else. And this is what worries Japan, for example. Well, as one Chinese said to me, in the 1980s, we were talking about flying geese, and that meant Japan. Well, we're talking about flying geese, and now the head of the pack is going to be China. Now, One last thing is I make it sound like China's speaking with one voice.
Right.
And a whole nother part of the book is saying, wait, there are a lot of people in China that don't think this is a terrific idea. It costs too much. If you're building in Pakistan, you've got terrorism, you got to provide security. As one said to me, democracies are pretty complicated to deal with. They keep electing new people that we don't have any guanxi with. So I don't want to put the vision. There's a big argument in China, just like there is over infrastructure anywhere else.
Yeah, so that not everybody has totally bought on, especially people who see this as potentially draining resources in the form of loans, in the form of subsidies, these kinds of questions. Everybody in China understands, well, it's a great thing for the big construction companies. It's a way of keeping them busy, having them extend their expertise and continue to work. But couldn't we use more of that help at home? Couldn't we funnel those resources here? Because we still have poor people, we still have areas where the infrastructure leaves something to be desired. So you definitely have that, but you also have these other players. And so in addition to the critics, you have a lot of people who might be broadly supportive of the idea because they see an opportunity. And maybe you could say something about those folks who see opportunity in this. To a certain extent, of course, it's Kunming, because Kunming is the China hub for this. But it's the neighboring provinces as well. And you have some companies that are quite eager. You have others who see opportunity. So maybe you could say something about this, because you've explained that to the extent that there is a grand strategy, it's that China should be the center. China should be the hub and both the engine and the beneficiary of economic activity in the region. But there's a lot of space between that and where should we build this railroad.
Exactly. You've expressed it so well. The first thing is the vision of the Chinese political system, and there's a chapter called Debates within China about the politics. But the broad picture is that what is the great leader? What is Xi Jinping? He's the guy that comes up with the idea of connectivity, and China's sort of the hub. And I don't mean in reality he just was the fount of all this vision, but he adopted it as his own and had it written into his constitution, along with several other things that are fairly authoritarian in character. So he's identified the center gets the vision, and it allocates a certain fraction of total budget to the vision. But how do you allocate that? And the answer is there are Chinese society at the bottom, or Chinese provinces, Chinese cities, and they all want a piece of the action. And so what they do, they have their pet projects, things they want to get accomplished in Yunnan or Guangxi, Guizhou. These provinces desperately want to hook up outside and escape the confines of isolation in China. So they're very big actors on this, and they will put forth plans. In fact, one province began the project figuring they would trap Beijing into having to approve it after it was going. So what you've got is a sort of strategic, big thinking top that puts out an idea, sort of makes at least the promise that there'll be some money, and then you have this very entrepreneurial system come up with all sorts of ideas, many of which might not be very good, many of which might not be very considerate of the environment or peasants getting displaced. But you have this mixture of control and almost out of control. And so, all the things that go wrong with these projects isn't because it was a detailed plan out of Beijing. I guess that's, so you've got a whole set of actors, but you go to the Northeast and you say, well, who's an interest group? Well, the China Rail Corporation that employs hundreds of thousands of people in Heilongjiang and Jilin, which are already hard hit economically, and no one's looking to disadvantage them more. So, you can recognize that as sort of the Midwest of the U.S., at least at certain points. Another very understandable thing, when I did the historical chapter, or we did the historical chapter, the French, as I said, had built in Vietnam. Who were the biggest supporters of rail development in Vietnam? The steel industry in France that was producing more steel than they could sell in Europe. So you have this excess. China built out its high speed and rail system, highway system, airports. They've got a huge industry. They've got to keep people employed, not only directly in building, but also in the supplier industries. So that's a whole nother politics. But I guess what I'm really saying is China has many of the same dynamics that we recognize elsewhere. Yeah, and we haven't even talked about the multilateral, well, we haven't talked much about multinational corporations.
Right.
And we haven't talked much about Asian Development Bank, World Bank, Asia Infrastructure Bank. But make a long story short, the world multilateral development agencies for about 20, 30 years weren't very keen on big infrastructure because of the human costs, displacement, environment. And so they went to capacity development, meaning human resources, education, health. And I'm not diminishing the importance of that. But now it's swinging back to more interest in infrastructure. And you can even see now the current administration has adopted an act in 2018 called the Build Act that appropriated money for infrastructure in Asia. Mm-hmm. So in any case, what I'm saying is there are a lot of interest groups here.
There's a lot at work, and you've already given us more topics to chew on in just a moment. We have a number of questions, and I want to get to those questions. So if you'd like to submit a question, please go to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, click on it, and type in your question. We've already gotten several very good ones. One of the things that you just highlighted is Belt and Road is part of the Constitution. It's not just part of the 5-year plan and things like that. And that makes Belt and Road a tool that politicians throughout southern China can use, that company heads can use. We want to build a bridge. We want to expand our production to meet X need. It's part of the Belt and Road Initiative sanctioned by President Xi. And so that, becomes its own little engine. Now, one of the things that you mentioned is that the Belt and Road Initiative, your focus is on these railroads and how that reflects Chinese capacity, Chinese ambition, and both the potential and the limits on Chinese power. So that's very much the focus. But as you noted, the Belt and Road Initiative includes ports. It includes building out this digital highway and things like that. So maybe you could say something about those ancillary aims, because, of course, with Made in China 2025 and other plans, there's a desire for China to be standard setting. And that's something that you mentioned with regard to the specifics of railroad construction, but it applies in the digital realm as well. Maybe you could say something about China as a standard setter.
Well, there are a lot of technologies that we could be talking about, and most of which I'm not qualified to talk about. So I'm more qualified to talk about this set of technologies, but I think it stands for a lot of the overall discussion, but you very rapidly end up exceeding your knowledge if you go too far. first of all, you're right. This is overall a multimodal concept. And some people have put the question this way. To what degree is this an economic endeavor? And to what is it a strategic, by which most people mean military or security? And the answer, I think, is both. Mm-hmm. But thus far, in the early stages, the the People's Liberation Army did not play a big role. In fact, a couple of people told me the PLA felt left out because you are talking about spending over $150 billion a year, and the PLA would, thank you very much, like to have another $150 billion. So the BRI, I think, generally speaking, got its initial push as an economic idea. It was driven by economically oriented interest groups. And this is, so I'm not heading in a direction of this ignoring Chinese security problems. Once you put assets, whether they're harbors or they're ports or they're rail terminuses, or they're rolling stock plants that China's, for instance, built one already in Malaysia. Investment will follow. If the theory follows, build a road, you get rich, people are going to invest their assets. And the Chinese want to control a lot of the development, commercial development and so on. And there was a big scandal in Malaysia where the rail terminus there, money was used out of an investment. The Chinese saved Najib, the prime minister at the time. And then, of course, he got thrown out in election 2018 for corruption. But what I'm saying is investment will follow these modes, whether they're cyber, whether it's transportation of other means. And so what the military follows that, because suddenly you have assets you got to protect. And in fact, I had one person in this case talking about a project, they were infrastructure in Pakistan, and they said, we're desperate about security for our people. Mm-hmm. And in fact, we know what the world will say if Chinese troops go to protect them. So we even thought about Blackwater, right, as a private security firm. Now, I don't know how many people thought about that and so forth. So what I would say is, as this gathers, the military will follow, or the security apparatus will follow. And so whether it was the initial intention or not, I think we fully have to anticipate it. Also, the Chinese see this strategically, building land routes to Singapore because they're uncertain about the security of the sea lanes. And of course, the U.S. Navy's concerned about those same sea lanes, and India is. And so this partly represents a diversification, and particularly if China's going to locate supply chains throughout the region, it has to be assured that it can continue to move goods. Now, of course, if you dream up a big enough conflict, nothing's safe. But in any case, that's, I think, a big part of what the Chinese. Now, you asked about standards. One of the big conflicts, I think, that's going to characterize the next 20 years, and the U.S., I think, is getting tuned into this, is that there are first mover advantages with new technology. And so Laos was tremendously important to the Chinese as the first leg, because once you build the track to the Lao border, then the only question is, how do you hook up across the boundary line? And that means you're going to have to employ Chinese standards to a considerable extent, both for hardware and software. And so as each link gets built, the Chinese can entrench more of their standards in the procurement process and so forth. And that means they have revenue streams for royalties and technology and licensing agreements and so forth. That's how that's what we did. And I think that's why we see this as, in a way, threatening. But you have to ask, what are we doing about it? You know, and it's not just that China's stealing technology, although as the book documents, they did lift a lot of technology from the Europeans and the Japanese. So I'm not whitewashing that. But the real issue is if we don't get on the ground floor, there's going to be a long tail to this activity in which we're, we may be subcontractors, but we're not driving the train.
Well, and not reaping the benefits of that intellectual property
right.
that comes from setting those standards, those sorts of things, which is quite important in the digital realm, for companies like Qualcomm and others, right? That sort of thing. Now, we have quite a few questions, and I'd like to kind of group a few of them together and come to you with them. One comes from somebody you know well, David Zweig, who is asking from Hong Kong, in looking at the Chinese bureaucracy in all of its different components. What did you find that may have been new? What surprised you? Because you, of course, have written extensively on policy making, policy implementation, how things are done, how things are sometimes undone.
Well, good to hear from David indirectly, and admire your work, David. First thing I wanted just to say about Hong Kong, just as long as we have a chance, talking about building out this rail interconnectivity. A very important part of that, and a part of the political negotiation between China and the countries involved, is what you might call software connectivity. That is immigration, control of stations, customs, processing, because the whole point is to have no stops or few stops at the highest possible throughput. So every time you have to stop at a border, and there are quite a few borders if you're going to Singapore, you want to have as smooth a process as possible. And I just think when I hear about Hong Kong and think about railroads, the big fight over that station in central Hong Kong with the high-speed rail from Guangzhou. And that, I don't want to say ripped apart Hong Kong, but it was part of the story of the gradually, or maybe not so gradually, decline of trust between the mainland and China. Certainly part of that story. As to what I found surprising, well, first of all, I've never been asked that question, so I'm thinking about it. But I guess what surprised me is the Chinese bureaucracy behaves like the Chinese bureaucracy. I mean, that's the first thing. And I remember back to one of the earlier edited books that was called Policy Implementation in China. And we categorized, and there were different chapters, and the theoretical chapters talked about all of the policy implementations we saw in China with virtually no change were policy implementation problems in at least some of the countries, if not all. Now, of course, part of China's particularity is the Communist Party and its control. So certainly that distinguishes from a lot of the countries here. But I would say what struck me is, and also the degree to which interest group analysis, even under Xi Jinping. I mean, we have this, it's like you have to keep two opposite ideas in your mind at the same time. Xi Jinping is the strongest leader for Deng Xiaoping. And if I look at a set of behaviors and institutional key points that he occupies, yeah, I'd say that. But then if you say, is he fully able to control what's going on? He looks sort of like Mao complaining about not being able to get pedicabs off the street in Beijing. So I guess it reinforced my biases as much as anything. But David, I'd be interested in your view.
Well, and also, in fact, I received an email today from the Hong Kong Trade Development Council asking for opportunities to plug us into the Belt and Road, that Hong Kong can get you onto the Belt and Road. But if I could go to another David, David Carl, and we have quite a few questions. David's question is similar to one asked by someone else, and that's looking at the politics of Southeast Asia. And you spend a large portion of the book is devoted to that. It's, these micro studies of how things happened or didn't happen in these various places. And so my question here is to ask you to elaborate on that, but also to ask about multilateralism within Southeast Asia. Sense of to what extent, if any, you see collaboration among the Southeast Asian countries in trying to deal with China, in trying to maximize the benefits for Southeast Asia, for those individual countries.
Right. That is, as you just said in your question, a significant part of the book. There's a chapter in and of itself on it out of the 8 chapters or 9, and but it permeates all the other or many of the other chapters. And the first thing to say is we talk about the name Southeast Asia at one level sort of suggests a homogeneity that doesn't exist when you're on the ground. And these are very different places. And that's why we had so many interviews and we had to have interpreters in different language groups. There was the whole logistics of dealing with the diversity of Southeast Asia. But if I was just to speak, we asked ourselves, why do some states in Southeast Asia respond more favorably to Chinese overtures than others? That's sort of the baseline question. And of course, the prior question is, do they respond differently to China? And the answer is yes, very differently. So then the question is, what sort of social science generalization could you make that who's more inclined to be cooperative and who's less so? And we had a couple of variables, but certainly economic levels important. I mean, Laos has relatively few choices. Play ball with the Chinese or stay poor, because nobody else, at least thus far, is investing there. And the lack of alternatives, if the U.S. or the Quad or EU and the U.S. or Japan and Korea, if we all were willing to invest in these places, there's a proclivity to cooperate with us. But they don't. And then, of course, we have a category of regimes like Cambodia and Myanmar that, for human rights reasons, and I'm not criticizing this, are sort of difficult for us to spread largesse on dictatorial regimes. Let's put it that way. But so certainly economic level, degree of political isolation, and another very important variable is the legitimacy story of each of these governments is different. And each of these requires a lot of more sophistication and subtlety than I can provide. But just take Vietnam. Vietnam's legitimacy story is we stood up to the Chinese. I mean, I think that ought to be the first clause. Not the Americans and the French, but the Chinese over a long period. And so it's intrinsically more complicated for the Vietnamese to allow an intrusive investment. Vietnam had riots over the question of Chinese owning property.
Well, and there was there were anti-Chinese riots that followed the placement of an oil drilling survey platform
right
off the coast. So that's before you talk about building a railroad and assigning land rights and things like that.
Exactly. So Vietnam, it has a little more economic wherewithal than some of the others, but not a lot. It has a real allergy to China, just sort of as a popular issue. And so they've been quite resistant. You take a place like Thailand that's much more economically, well, there are lots of differences, but Thailand's economically in much better shape, but it's state independent and doesn't have that historical grudge on its shoulder about having been a colony. And therefore, as one person said, Thailand is a beautiful lady. We have many suitors. We can take our time. And so we find Wang Yi, it was scheduled to go to Bangkok today and tomorrow to sign an agreement for part of the rail link towards Laos. And also in Thailand, the state rail authority already owns all the land. They don't have to displace much of anybody. Indonesia, they got to displace almost everybody, right? So the point is, these are real places with real legitimacy stories and different kind of politics. I mean, if you convince the Lao Communist Party to go along with a plan, they're probably going to go along with it. Doesn't mean no problems, but they'll go along with it. If you go to Malaysia and they throw out Najib and suddenly you got Mahathir again, you got a big problem. So I would say there are diverse responses, and I don't want to sound too. It's understandable. It's a mystery only because we don't look at these phenomena too often.
Yeah, and we have a number of people from Southeast Asia bringing up questions. Among them, the question about Vietnam. A Vietnamese American friend of mine grew up in Vietnam, and she said that, in school she thought they were constantly at war with China, and then she became a historian of Vietnam, and turns out that the battles were much fewer and farther between. But right. In any case. One of the questions that is being raised here is this, to a certain extent, is predicated on China's continuing economic capacity. Right. China's, the last several decades of rapid economic growth will continue. And that will throw off the revenues that will be needed for the policy banks to carry out these, to implement loans and do things like that. To what extent, and now I'm asking you to wear an economic forecaster hat, and that's quite unfair, but China's economic future is tied to this, but so, as you've outlined, is the economic future of these Southeast Asian nations. And so maybe you could say something about the we're in this together state of affairs.
Well, I think that's an excellent question. And there's a part of the book that deals with that. And it gets to this notion of we start with a fact that growth is slowing in China, right? Which you implied and mentioned. And I think we want to say one thing about that. Yes, it's slowing, but even now it's positive and it's significant. Well, and of course, powers are
like a third of global growth still being generated out of China.
Yeah, right. So, people go and place their bets where there's growth over the long run. And I think everybody on the one hand knows China's growth is slowing. We know they have banking problems, and I'm not trying to, total debt is in some sense alarming. So there are clouds on this horizon. But if you just sort of look, and there was an excellent article I read in the Burmese paper that says, the Americans in the West, they're not necessarily finished, but China's going to eclipse them, and we have to build our future on a relative shift in economic power. And that's before you get to proximity. Right. So I think Southeast Asia has concluded that growth will continue in China in all probability, that's the most best bet to make. And if you just look back to 1997, 98 Asian financial crisis, 2008-9 global financial crisis, China slowed down, but it usually was for shorter period than anybody else. And then they cranked it back up. And so I think you've got a community to the south of China, and that's that's where the vision of this hub and this north-south connectivity. The more the Chinese invest in that connectivity, the more they make themselves the outlet, and then particularly if they go on to Europe and Northeast Asia. So I think they're, correct about that China's probably going to continue to grow. If China has doesn't meet that expectation, it's going to be a problem not only for Southeast Asia, but the global economy. So I think the U.S. needs to think strategically, okay, how, and this gets to the other part of the vision here. The Chinese believe as their growth slows, which they believe it will, they need to compensate because Southeast Asia is a higher growth potential, and they can export to that, move up the value chain, and I think they genuinely believe if they increase the economic welfare of the countries around them, you make more money selling to rich people than poor people. I mean, that's pretty much how I think they see it. So it's easier to prosper in a rich community, meaning community of nations, than a poor community. And I think that's the guiding vision. Then finally, if we're going to convince them they're wrong, and I don't actually think they probably are, but we've got to get in the game. And of course, given our preoccupations, our involvement militarily, our domestic gridlock, given our obvious crying needs for infrastructure here, healthcare, retirement, just go on, it's going to be hard to convince Americans to dump enormous amounts of money into distant projects when it's hard to get from Washington to New York on a train.
And easier from Washington to New York than from Los Angeles, perhaps, to San Francisco. But in any case, you've highlighted one of the other questions that people have raised. People in the Q&A, they've talked about development schemes facilitating corruption, that these kinds of opportunities. And you've already discussed that with regard to the American experience, of building the Transcontinental Railroad, that sort of thing. But also, folks are asking, well, Southeast Asia, of course, has a lot of ties culturally with India. And so where is India in this? How does India fit? And as you mentioned, with the United States, putting forward this idea of this Quad, the Indo-Pacific, these sorts of ideas, how does that fit into this mix? Who are the other potential players?
Right. There is some discussion and of India and other players, which you would include the Canadians, the Koreans, the French, the Germans. And then when you get to subsystems, control systems, signaling, safety systems, that you even have more involved. So there is a big network of countries that are involved. But India is really interesting. Well, India, of course, the British initially built what system there was, and then it's been added on in the post-liberation period for India. I have a figure in the book. I can't remember it, but it's like, 20,000 trains a day in India. I mean, it just boggled my mind, the expanse and the passenger load carried. So I don't think we recognize, and India has therefore a rail industry, and it's not nearly as advanced as China, much less the West, but they have ambitions, and they're working on high-speed trains. And the degree to which India wants to go up the value chain, they see themselves competing for access to markets. Ergo, they want to build trains east-west. So one of the strategic questions Americans and others might ask is, we shouldn't be just an assertion. Maybe we should think about not opposing China, but maybe facilitating balanced connectivity and reinforcing the connections from India across Myanmar, across Thailand, across Cambodia to Vietnam. And Japan and the ADB have been much warmer to that that conception. So for the U.S., maybe what our companies ought to be thinking about, as well as our government, is building consortia of our friends to build, not diminish what China's doing, but to, in fact, build an integrated network that can meet more needs than just north-south flows towards China. But that requires paying attention and having a policy. And, well, I guess we all know where we are now.
Yeah. And so in the book, you talk about this balanced connectivity, and you talk about these different kinds of things, because it's not as though the countries of Southeast Asia are turning their backs on the United States, turning their backs on Japan. None of that is happening.
Right.
You discuss the hedging and the eagerness on the part of Southeast Asian countries to want others to be involved. And maybe more about that.
I'll give you the extreme example that makes the general point, and then mention one other, because it's in a different category, but same point. Cambodia. Now, I'll just stipulate that they have a really rough regime, and it's undesirable in any human rights context. I'll just stipulate that. Mm-hmm. And therefore, they've basically been portrayed and actually driven into the arms or the pocket of Beijing. And they're seen as the guys that when an ASEAN vote comes along, if Beijing wants a thumbs down on the vote, Cambodia is a reliable negative vote, or at least will overturn the consensus. I had more than one Cambodian, and including government people, say, if we had more options to cooperate with you, we would do so. Now, in this case, I guess it's us saying we do not wish to cooperate until you change internal practices, and I can't morally opine that that's the wrong choice. In fact, I'm not convinced it is. But you go to Thailand, and when they had the President military coup, cooperation levels went down, and they moved closer to Beijing precisely to send a message to the Americans: we want to cooperate, but we're not going to do it with sanctions. So, and in Vietnam, I think we can clearly see there's a high degree of desire to cooperate with the Americans, even in very incendiary military dimensions. So I didn't find anywhere in Southeast Asia that of the 8 countries that we dealt with, including Indonesia, that were opposed to more what they would have called constructive American involvement. And we just have to decide, what is our trade-off? Where does our desire to have a balanced system in Asia fit versus a rule of law Asia? Now, they're not necessarily totally opposed, but we seem to formulate it as a choice to be made. And so that's for us to choose, but I think there's a receptivity there.
Well, I quite agree. And as you have in the book, and as you've just given us now, there's quite a few examples of that desire for the United States to be engaged, for the United States to be part of this discussion. Now, we only have a few minutes left, and I've kept you longer than I originally requested of you. Thank you for being so generous with your time. But a couple of questions. One comes from one of the viewers who says, I've been to Kunming, but it was a long time ago. It was a decade ago. How is Kunming different? And so I guess what we're asking here is, what does the Belt and Road Initiative look like in terms of the built landscape? Now, you've already highlighted, the tunnel building in Laos and things like that, just the extraordinary feats of engineering. But what is the sensation one has when seeing all of this in action?
Well, it's dramatic. Of course, for the last 40 years, we've always said, if you haven't been to China in 6 months, you haven't been to China, right? So this is dramatic. But I've I don't remember all the times I've been to Kunming, but I remember I went early in the 80s, and there were a lot of, I went in 1979, actually. I remember the war with Vietnam was going on at that time, with full of troops. There were lots of wooden structures, a very, what I would call traditional Chinese city, grubby, poor. I went with the Health Education Secretary of the U.S., and so we went to a lot of hospitals, and it was pretty miserable. And so it was a lot of dirt roads around the city core. And the city struck you as quite small. Then I went back not too long ago, about a year and a half, I guess. It's a modern metropolis, a huge government buildings. They're proud to bring you in. The city is, I don't know, I haven't got population figures over time, but dramatically bigger and with modern buildings. The other thing you note is lots of international presence there. A multinational corporation headquarters, hotels, all of that kind of thing, which was absent, 20 years before or 30 years before. But what actually, and the Kunming, they're building this big hub railroad stations. I mean, even, provincial capitals and even some big cities that aren't provincial capitals have enormous rail stations and so on. Kunming has that, and it's connected now. Kunming used to be a backwater. Now, as the map shows, it's the hub for transportation off to Chongqing, going to the west, and then off through Guizhou on to Guangzhou. And you can see all along those corridors, brand new businesses build up. Sometimes it's industrial parks, but it's also just development for rail and tourists and so forth. Often they're built to look like traditional Chinese architecture, but as a shopping mall, right? So, and you find people now from Kunming or Guizhou, Guiyang, preferring to take the train because it's faster than the airplane. Mm-hmm. And of course, cars all over the place. So I'd say it's night and day.
Yeah, it's a dramatic transformation. And that speaks to, this overall project where you are trying to take apart something that's very much moving, something that is moving in multiple directions at the behest of multiple players, both within China and outside of China. And you just mentioned too, multinational firms. We have firms that specialize in construction, managing pipelines, all kinds of companies from the United States and elsewhere that want to be part of this and are to a limited extent. Now, one of the questions that comes up when I'm reading this book is you folks are on the ground. You are interviewing all of these folks. Before these interviews, you've gathered all kinds of documents. So you've prepared questions. You have some idea of what the stated intentions might be. And then you're carrying out all of these interviews in China and in these other countries. Could you do this book today? Could you do it in this way?
I think it would be different. I mean, because at one level you could study this, but how would it be different? And indeed, we are thinking about at some point, because so little of it has actually been built compared to the totality, you might want to come back 5 or 10 years and ask what happened and why. So certainly people will, because it's important and transformative, but they will suffer under some problems that we didn't have. First of all, it was such a big project, as I started by saying, us 3 co-authors, each were totally equal in all respects. But they had, in the case of Malaysia or Singapore, contacts we needed. So I would say, however one does this, you've got to have talent from multiple places. Now, you're probably not going to have all from every single place, and that might be a little overkill. But I don't think a thorough job could be done without more than one sort of country specialist or political system specialist. What will be different is, and this goes, I think it speaks to life, it speaks to research, there's a luck of the draw. Mm-hmm. What order did we do our interviews? Well, we started in China because I knew more Chinese and had the contacts. And after all, I wanted to find out how they built their own domestic system, which they're very proud of, mm-hmm. and they love to talk about. So we picked an open area at an open time. Well, now the political winds, I don't need to describe them to this audience, is not favorable. They think the United States will basically use every piece of information to China's disadvantage. And that really wasn't the assumption even 5 years ago. And so I would not expect people that I've known for 40 years, I don't think they would talk as openly. Not particularly because they distrust me, I think, or my colleagues, but because the price of saying the wrong thing is going up in China. So I think that I think we will get a higher quality of data on China now or past than we would anticipating in the future. And of course, China could change, but that I think would be different. Also, the degree to which China and the U.S. are at loggerheads, mm-hmm. Southeast Asians are very attuned to not looking like they want to take sides. And they've always been afraid of that. But the worse the problem becomes between us and China, if that's what happens, I think they'll be a little more cautious in a project that intrinsically involves China. And of course, as China's weight in these areas increases, if that's what happened, they'll be more sensitive to China yet still. So I think the interview strategy would still be necessary, but might not be quite as productive as at least I felt it was. But we had to interview in over 150 organizations. Mm-hmm. So you're talking about a big commitment of time and money and just fostering a trust that people will talk to you. And I don't mean to say we assuaged all fears. I'm sure we didn't. But if they didn't tell us everything, they told us a lot.
Well, and as you describe, the suspicions that exist today make a lot of this kind of work difficult. People you've known for decades, they know you, they trust you. But going into these different organizations where you are not a known commodity, where your defining characteristic is that of an outsider, right. Particularly an American, could influence that. So we are so lucky that you and your colleagues undertook this work and went in to all of these different organizations to try to get a sense of where things had been, where they were, and how things might go. And so thank you for all of that effort and for bringing us this wonderful book. It is a terrific read, and I want to encourage everybody watching both the live broadcast, but also the video on our website or on our YouTube channel to take advantage of this opportunity, get this book, and dive in. There's so much here, and it's a very different take than some other reports or books about the Belt and Road, where some people are primarily concerned with security questions and talking about weaponizing the Belt and Road. And others are focused on the problems of the Belt and Road, particularly in Pakistan and some of these other areas. But I just want to say thanks and offer you, Professor Lampton, if there's something you'd like to say in conclusion, this opportunity.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you and all the people who have participated and viewed this. I would just say, apropos of the last about studying China, I think in one respect, we're going to have to go back towards the toolbox we had in the I don't want to create an equivalency with the Cold War, but we're going to have to get better at studying China from outside of China. I mean, I think the relative weight of access. And so we're going to have to look at questions that increasingly involve China's impact on third localities. And of course, at least when I went through graduate school, you had to study from Taiwan and Hong Kong predominantly. I don't know what the new platforms will be, probably global in nature. But I think it's going to be an exciting future. But how we study it, we'll do our best.
Well, and you've launched us in this direction, looking at China beyond the boundaries of China and all of the different questions. So thanks to you for bringing this book to fruition. It's available now. And thanks to all of the people who took time to join us today. Please stay in touch. Make sure you're on our mailing list. Go to china.usc.edu, click on that subscribe button to get on the newsletter so that you will, in addition to hearing about these kinds of programs, you'll also get notified when the videos are available on our website. Please do take care and know that we look forward to having everybody back sometime soon. Bye.